April 1945, Germany. In a liberated prison camp outside a ruined factory town, hundreds of starving prisoners stood in line with empty bowls while sacks of flour and tins of meat disappeared into an American supply truck. The food had been sent for them. Captain Willis Cramer had ordered it loaded for sale on the black market, then told the prisoners the convoy had never arrived. A French survivor collapsed before his bowl was filled. Cramer looked at him and said, "They were dying before we got here." Then General George S. Patton arrived to inspect the camp and noticed the truck was too heavy to be empty. What he did next made hunger speak louder than rank. Before we get into what happened next, if you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. The camp had been found 2 days earlier near a rail spur and a bombed textile mill. It was not large enough to be famous, but it was large enough to hold misery. The barracks smelled of sickness, coal dust, and men who had been too weak to wash for months. When American medics entered, some prisoners cried. Others only stared, because hope itself felt dangerous. Food was the first problem. Doctors warned the soldiers not to feed the prisoners too quickly. Starved bodies could be killed by kindness if heavy meals came too fast. So the camp received controlled rations: broth, soft bread, powdered milk, flour for thin porridge, and small portions of meat for those strong enough to digest it. Every spoonful had to be counted. Jean Moreau was one of the men waiting in line. He had been a printer in Lyon before the Germans sent him east for helping distribute resistance leaflets. He was 46, though his face looked older. His hands, once steady enough to set tiny metal letters, now shook so badly he needed both of them to hold a bowl. He had survived the camp by sharing what little he found: a peel of potato, a crust stolen from a guard bucket, a mouthful of soup passed to a boy who no longer had the strength to lift his head. Liberation had not made his body whole again. It had only allowed him to keep suffering without being beaten for it. That morning, he stood beside a Polish teenager named Marek, who leaned against him like a younger brother. They had been told the new food convoy had arrived. For the first time in months, prisoners began whispering about tomorrow. Then the kitchen ran out. The cauldron scraped empty before half the line had eaten. Bowls remained raised. Men stared at the bottom of the pot as if food might appear by pity alone. A camp interpreter went to the supply tent and returned pale. "There is no more," he said. But there was more. Behind the infirmary, Captain Cramer was supervising 4 enlisted men as they moved sacks and tins into a covered truck. He was a quartermaster officer assigned to distribute emergency food inside the camp. He had discovered quickly that liberated towns nearby were desperate too. Civilians with watches, silver spoons, gasoline, and money would pay anything for American food. Cramer had begun by taking 1 crate, then 3, then enough to change the rations of hundreds of prisoners. He told himself the food would be replaced. He told himself the prisoners were already under medical care. He told himself that in war every supply line leaked, and a clever man simply made sure some of it leaked toward him. A young cook named Private Eddie Walsh saw the flour loaded into the truck and asked why it was leaving. Cramer answered, "Redistribution." "To where, sir?" "To people who can use it." Walsh looked toward the prisoners. "They can use it." Cramer stepped close enough for Walsh to smell coffee on his breath. "Private, your job is stirring pots. My job is supply." When Walsh did not move, Cramer added, "And if you accuse an officer of theft, you had better be ready to prove every missing ounce." Walsh lowered his eyes. A few minutes later, Jean Moreau reached the front of the line. His bowl received 1 ladle of gray water with 3 floating grains. Marek got nothing. Jean tried to hand his bowl to the boy, but his knees folded before he could finish. He fell without a sound. The prisoners around him did not panic. They had seen men fall before. That was the terrible thing. They simply made space so the medics could reach him. Walsh ran to the kitchen tent and demanded help. Cramer arrived first. The captain looked at Jean on the ground, then at the empty pot. "Keep them in order," he said. Walsh said, "Sir, the food is in that truck." Cramer's face changed. "You will be silent. They are starving. They were starving yesterday." Walsh stared at him. Cramer spoke low, but the words carried. "They were dying before we got here." An American corporal heard it. So did the interpreter. So did Marek, who understood only the tone but understood enough. The corporal reported to a lieutenant, who reported to the camp commandant. The commandant had already suspected something was wrong. Ration records showed delivery. Kitchen records showed shortage. Prisoners showed the truth on their faces. A message reached Patton that afternoon while he was touring medical facilities in the area. The report was cautious. Possible diversion of prisoner food by a quartermaster officer, witness statements pending, truck on site. Patton did not ask for a full investigation first. He asked one question. "Are they hungry now?" "Yes, sir." "Then we go now." His jeep entered the camp yard under a low gray sky. Prisoners watched from the barracks doors. Some recognized the authority in the way American soldiers stepped aside, but most were too tired to care about stars on a helmet. Patton walked first to the kitchen. He saw the empty cauldron. He saw the line of bowls stacked along a bench, many still clean because nothing had been placed inside them. Then he saw Jean Moreau lying on a cot near the infirmary, awake but barely able to speak. Patton asked the medic, "What happened?" "Collapse from starvation, sir. He missed the ration." "Why?" The medic looked toward the supply tent. Patton turned. Cramer came forward before he was called, saluting sharply. He had the careful confidence of a man who believed paperwork was armor. "General, there has been confusion in ration accounting." Patton looked past him at the covered truck. "What is in there?" "Excess stores awaiting transfer." "Open it." Cramer hesitated for less than a second. That was enough. Patton said, "Open it now." The canvas flap was pulled back. Flour sacks, tins of meat, powdered milk, coffee, and crates of bread filled the truck bed. Some had medical ration markings. Others were still sealed from the original convoy. Patton climbed onto the rear step and looked inside. Then he looked at the prisoners holding empty bowls. "How many men were not fed?" The camp commandant answered, "About 300, sir." Patton turned to Cramer. "And how much excess did you have?" Cramer swallowed. "General, I was reallocating supplies to prevent spoilage." "Spoilage?" "Yes, sir. Some items were unsuitable for immediate prisoner feeding." Patton reached into the truck, lifted a tin, and handed it to the surgeon. "Can this be used?" "In controlled portions, yes." Patton pointed to a sack of flour. "This?" "For porridge, sir." "Powdered milk." "This?" "Yes, sir." Patton faced Cramer again. "You stole food from starving men and called it accounting." Cramer's voice tightened. "I did not steal. I intended redistribution through proper channels."